Welcome in. Welcome to Powell Study of Books. We are grabbing some more chairs, by the way, so don't get too comfortable standing, even though that's probably hard to do. Thank you for joining us for tonight's event. A reminder to please silence your cell phones. I don't know who doesn't do that these days, but go ahead and do that if you haven't already. You can check out our lineup of events these days on our website at powells.com/events. And do take a moment to follow us on social media as well. We're on pretty much everything these days, even TikTok, because we're hip with the youths. That's what they even say. I don't know. But that's at Powell's Books, of course. Also, tonight's event, please do keep in mind that we ask no flash photography, no videography. We do have someone here on the premises doing that already for promotional work, so please do not do that. Tonight's event is packed tight. We have 3 conversation partners tonight, which has never happened for me. My name is Stacy. I work on the events team here. So I'm really excited. But I'm really excited to welcome Shane and his new book, No Pasarán. I hope I am saying that correctly. It is an anthology of anti-fascist musings that tackle a myriad of angles against the far right. And at risk of sounding pedantic, for any of you that don't know, No Pasarán is Spanish for they will not pass, which to our collective disappointment has nothing to do with Gandalf and the Balrog. I'm just very disappointed about that one. But you know, No Pasarán takes on new significance from its Spanish Civil War origins as an anti-fascist slogan and rally cry. Perfect title for this piece, I think. I wanted to read this to you guys. Vicky Osterweil, I think Osterwheel, I'm not sure, author of In Defense of Looting, A Riotous History of Uncivil Action, had this to say about No Pasarán. Quote, "This is one of my favorite kinds of book, an indispensable resource for creating a world where it would be useless." Close quote. I don't know, I just really love that. Shane's other works on anti-fascism have been featured on NBC News, The Baffler, The Independent, and The Daily Beast. He will be joined in conversation today by Mike Crenshaw, a poet, hip-hop artist, educator, and activist, Alexander Reid Ross, a geographer, professor at PSU, and executive committee member of the Global Network for Research on the Far Right. And we also have Abner Häuge, founder, editor of Left Coast Right Watch. And I got his last name right, which I was really worried about.
That's right.
All right. This event will include an audience Q&A following and a signing, so save your questions until then. We'll begin the line kind of over this way and towards the back. A gentle reminder that we do close at 8:55 p.m. sharp this evening. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to these guys. Thank you so much.
Thanks to everyone that came out. I had a kind of weird message. Somebody emailed me and asked why someone would need a book like this. And it was about a day or so after I'd gone away for Yom Kippur, and I came back to a flurry of angry messages of people threatening to show up here, to try and cancel the book event, come to my home, things like that. And that kind of proved the point of why we would need a book like this. So the idea of this actually came right after I did my first book, when there was a lot of flurry, a lot of conversation about it. Some folks here probably came to the earlier event, but there wasn't a lot of diversity in how we actually talked about anti-fascism. It was basically people in black masks, they go out, they block roads, and that was about the end of the story. So we wanted to talk to people, hear from folks. We wanted to go international, we wanted to talk about different ideas, mutual aid, community organizing, how people are experiencing this, what people are doing, maybe what it will look like in the future, because it's not all going to look like the same thing that we've seen on news reports in Portland streets and things like that. It's changing. The far right is growing and changing, and that means the anti-fascists have to change likewise. So I wanted to bring 3 folks that read chapters in this, very, very different. So I'm going to kind of talk with them a little bit about what they wrote about, some ideas that kind of are simmering throughout the book, and then I'll open up for questions. This goes fast, so we'll try and kick it over to folks pretty soon. So I was going to start with you, Mike. So we did this sort of like a conversation between us. And Mike, you were an early founder of the Baldies, which is an anti-racist skinhead crew. And that might be confusing to some folks that never heard of an anti-racist skinhead crew. They've heard of racist folks that call themselves skinheads. So what is it? Why did you form the Baldies? And what was the goal of it?
We were a group of friends in the hardcore punk scene Initially, there was a group of us that were straight edge, so I needed to, because of my own issues with addiction, drugs and alcohol, I needed to make some sober time in my life and reprioritize what I was doing at the age of 15, 16. Met a group of friends who were not getting high and drunk. Turns out that my biggest fear at the time was that my life was going to be boring if I wasn't getting fucked up all the time. And so to find some kids that were into intense music and skateboarding and really having as much fun as we could possibly have together without getting high, that was the initial. So out of necessity, a social necessity to change the type of people I was hanging with, turns out that group of friends we developed an interest in the skinhead style. We were curious about it, we didn't know what it was, we liked the aesthetic, and so we started to study it. We started first with shaving our heads, but then other elements of the uniform became clear, that traditionally we were supposed to have Doc Marten boots because the style would come from working class kids in England, and there were certain elements to be an authentic skinhead, starting with the aesthetic, the look, the uniform. So as we started to study this book, Skinhead by Nick Knight, and catch word of mouth of other skinhead crews in other cities, and the right music to listen to, which ranged from ska to hardcore punk to oi, we started to notice that in the media, there was a lot of media coverage of neo-Nazi skinheads. So Sally Jesse Raphael, Donahue, Oprah, Time, Newsweek were all highlighting and showcasing neo-Nazi skinheads. So in the mind of the public, outside of our insular scene, people began to associate the term skinhead with neo-Nazis. Right about then, a group of white supremacist skinheads called the White Knights popped up in our scene in Minneapolis. This is 86, 87. They were led by a local person who identified as skinhead, who's also came out on the evening news as a member of the Klan, local chapter of the Klan. So once we found out about this, we sought them out, we found them, we confronted them, and we gave them a warning. We said, next time we see you, if you're still claiming white power, then there's going to be problems. And from then, the violence ensued, and we had to organize within our community for community defense and our own safety. Because what would often happen at shows or in the neighborhoods was one of us would see them, we'd be outnumbered, we'd get jumped. And so this went back and forth. We fought for a number of years, and then eventually we started to organize outside of our immediate community in Minneapolis, in the South Minneapolis hardcore punk scene, with other cities in the Midwest. Madison, Wisconsin, Indianapolis, Indiana. Chicago was heavy, we were very tight with Chicago. So that's how all these came about. And I think that the political orientation of anti-fascism was something, it was us just responding to this element that arose in our community, and our identity was very clearly not racist because we're a group of multi-ethnic kids who loved each other. And so we also felt like we had to protect the brand of what we were doing from this tidal wave of misinformation that was actually causing violent threat to our existence.
I mean, so it's almost like pre-political. People of their community, they're defending their communities before they're thinking about it like an activist scene, trying to make those kind of campaigns, that kind of thing.
Right, and then, being a black kid in a mostly white scene, even though a significant number of Baldies were non-white, the political nature of just being who I am was part of the response. And only later, when I started to get a political education in a more academic sense, was I able to correlate the choices that we made with broader, deeper, longer historic movements.
How did that lead to the formation of Anti-Racist Action? And for folks who don't know, Anti-Racist Action, ARA, was sort of a preceding movement to kind of modern Antifa groups, really prominent here in the early 90s in Portland, a big part of that history.
So ARA was founded, when we had to organize outside of our immediate friend circle for our own safety and protection, because now that there's this violent confrontation happening on a regular basis, day to day, week to week in cities in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul, we realized that there was a core group of anti-racist skinheads that were fighting these neo-Nazis, but we also wanted to build allegiances with people who weren't necessarily skinheads, who didn't wear the uniform, but who also wanted to get the Nazis out of the city. Okay, and so that network, it started with our friends who were also on the punk scene, anarchists, other punks that weren't skinheads, skaters. Then it went to gang members from different ethnic gangs, from the folks in People's Nations, and then it went to some older activists that might have been students and parts of different formations that weren't involved in the punk scene. And then that spread from Minneapolis, St. Paul, again to other cities in the Midwest. And we came to find out that simultaneous to our struggles in Minneapolis, these things were happening all over the Midwest and other cities, Detroit, Chicago, Kansas City, and so on and so forth. And again, in retrospect, we start to see that these things are happening in the Reagan era because of the same thing that we see happening in this country today, which is late-stage capitalism, vanishing entitlement of the working class, white working class, getting into rage and anger and xenophobia and expressing themselves the way that they do.
I mean, there's a big thread through the book of subcultures and the role that it's not just mass movements, but it's actually some subcultures. I mean, Sasha, you talk about that kind of an earlier subculture. What's surrealism? What does it have to do with anti-fascism?
All right, well, now for something completely different. So surrealism is a lot like that punk movement, right? It's like a lot like that, kind of a little bit pre-political. The early surrealists were like more on the anarchist side of things. They're really kind of like a romantic movement. They built up on the Dreyfusard movement in France that was around the late 19th century. So this was a whole movement against anti-Semitism that had basically swept through France, and there were like anti-Semitic riots, and there was groups of artists, literary figures, anarchists, socialists, who would come together, and they would have these raucous journals, these crazy plays. I don't know if y'all know, like Pere Ubu from Jari, Guillaume Apollinaire, like there's a Rimbaud and Lautréamont. Like there's a lot of these kinds of poets and these figures who were kind of breaking a lot of the rules of sort of society and of art. And that's what the Surrealists built off of. But they came around after World War I in like a true situation of despair amid an epidemic, flu pandemic, right? And so the thing that they wanted to bring to the world was a sense of what André Breton called mad love, right? They just wanted to break free of all the constraints and just, find another way of life, right? A different theory of time where they could sort of break away from the things that would force them into lives that they didn't want to lead, right? And they would do this through poetry, but also through really, really weird stuff. Like just weird stuff. Like they have had this whole thing called the time of the slumbers, where they would hypnotize one another, and then they would like, there was one scene where a surrealist started chasing another one around the house with a knife. There was another time when a guy got 3 or 4 of them to almost on the verge of hanging themselves. But that was where they stopped, because it really did get really wild and kind of unfortunate. That's kind of the thing about the surrealists, is that you have to understand that while they had this beautiful impulse and this amazing kind of life and this wonderful philosophy of life and of love, they were also like really problematic, right? Like there was a lot of stuff about them that was like, I wouldn't have done that, but like, we don't know because we're all kids sometimes. And yeah, so they move on from this and they create this whole culture really around anti-colonialism, right? Because we're talking about France in the 1920s. And they kind of disseminate all this stuff, like they're saying outrageous stuff and being threatened by the far right. They're getting into fights with one another, especially during the break with Dadaism. where Breton breaks a Dadaist arm on stage. Violent people, actually, which is ironic because they're also full of so much love. But their argument, legitimate defense against colonialism, but not only against colonialism, in favor of fighting against colonialism, right? In favor of anti-colonial wars throughout the world, ended up being suppressed by the Communist Party because it was too radical. Once they went over to the Communist Party, they said, you can't talk about that stuff anymore, it's too radical. But some people did hear what they were saying. And a whole journal in Martinique by mostly black authors formed called Legitimate Defense. And they were saying, we don't have a proletariat here in the colonies, so we have to speak to the learned classes, right? We have to speak to the professors and the doctors, and we have to tell them, that they're the bourgeoisie and they need to abandon their own families, in a sense. So, again, outrage, everywhere they went, whether it was Martinique, whether it was the Cuban surrealists, whether it was the surrealists in Egypt who would ultimately be suppressed by Nasser, they just started all kinds of turmoil. And in a way, that's kind of what they thrived off of, because obviously, they're sensationalists, they're poets, they want to, enrapture people, and they want to draw people away from everyday life. And so for them, in a sense, it's kind of like an escape. They're trying to get out of the world and start a new one, right? It's a real revolution. And yeah, that was kind of their thing. That was like the sort of the good, the bad, and the whatever of surrealism. I don't know. Yeah. And then you must be wondering, what is surrealism, right? What were they even doing? And there are so many definitions of it, but I think that the one that makes the most sense is that they were trying to bring their inner understanding of the outside world back into the outside world, right? So that was their theory, and it's so interesting. All their journals and their arguments and their debates within surrealism, their splits, all about trying to get to the truth. A lot of people think surrealism is about kind of trying to muddy the waters, confuse things, destroy reality, because this is surrealism. It's actually about understanding reality to the point of being sort of above it and of creating a new reality, right? The Rudy quote, right? The new world in our hearts, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and it's almost, I guess, I sort of pivoted to Abner to talk about your work. Just kind of this idea of truth telling. I mean, we know each other a lot from these really ugly scenes in sort of disaster zones in Portland streets, not just Portland streets, other streets, of trying to do what seems like a normal, productive job of doing journalism and having, to wear bulletproof vests and things like that. Talk a little bit about your work, Left Coast Rights Watch. How did it start, I guess, and how's it a little bit different than regular bourgeois press?
The bourgeois press. That's a great question. I thought that was way funnier than other people did. Anyways, yeah, so I went to school at UC Berkeley Grad School of Journalism, and it was the worst 2 years of my life, mostly because grad school usually is for most people. But on top of that, there was, well, let me back up. So it was 2012. I was, let me back up further than that, actually, because I've been thinking about this for a while.
It was 1985.
It was actually, it was 1988, and my parents were about to get, no, it was 88. My parents were about to get married. They'd have me a year later. And my white grandmother told my dad that my mom's Pakistani, and my white grandmother told my dad that she didn't want my dad to marry my mom because she married her kids all off to a lot of like East Asian people for the most part, because she thought they were smarter. And she thought that my mom was like genetically stupider, and so she didn't want my dad to marry my mom. So I've been, I guess like Phil Collins said, as I was waiting for that moment all my life, oh Lord. Another thing that happened was basically, it was 2012, and one of my best friends, like she like just come out, started dressing as a woman, and like, I mean, you know, subjective terms, right? But like she started transitioning, right? And I had just moved up to the Bay Area. We grew up in Monterey, and like, you know, it's a liberal but very stuffy area. But she stayed at my apartment for a while because like she could, you know, have a safe place to like, you know, go out and get dressed, and I'd drop her off at the BART station, and she'd go on dates and go out and have fun in the city and like, you know, be like, live as a woman basically. And there was one morning, like after she come back to my place, like after like staying the night at somebody else's place, she told me like, hey, so I was getting on the Daly City train, and there were these fucking guys, these like Nazi skins that started catcalling me because she was like wearing a black leather jacket and a skirt and shit, and like, you know, they want to hit on all the cute punk girls, right? But then, you know, she hadn't started HRT or anything, so they got a closer look at her and started calling her slurs, and then I guess she told him fuck you or something, I don't really remember, but she started running like through the fucking BART train cars while they were chasing her with a knife, and she got away, but like for about like 5 years, I just had this thought in the back of my head, was like, I couldn't have done anything for her, and I wish I could have. And when I got to UC Berkeley, like, I had gotten really fucking high on protest coverage. Like, I was just, like, there was people burning, like, trash cans at the night, a few nights after Trump won in Oakland, and it was, like, some of the most fun I've had covering shit, which is kind of cynical and dark to admit, but hey, I'm not gonna bullshit you people. But this guy called Milo Yiannopoulos was coming to my campus, and I didn't know who he was. Yeah, hiss, please hiss at him, fuck that guy. And I figured out who he was. Clearly this crowd knows who the guy is, but my introduction to him was like looking up who he was and seeing the time he like put some trans girl's like photo on a big billboard, like on his projector screen, and like as big as this wall. And I just watched this footage of all these little fucking piece of shit Nazi youth like leering and jeering at her and smiling with their little fucking perfect white teeth. And I just knew I had to fuck this guy over somehow. And it was a weird year because I kind of ended up failing that mission in a way. So basically what I did was I said, I took the like UC Berkeley very liberal program, obviously. You know, they're like, oh, you have to be very both sides and, you know, cover everybody and be very fair to everybody. So I kind of just weaponized that, and I kind of just like went up to the Berkeley College Republicans and was like, can I just like film all of your weekly meetings? And they said yes, because they were so happy for the attention. And I started making this documentary where like week after week, they bring in all these crazy people there would be people in that class plotting all of the like street fights that happened in Berkeley. Like, just fucking planning them in those meetings. And then I'd go to the street fights and film them. And then I'd meet people there, and everybody was just thinking, oh, I'm a kind of like libertarian leaning, like, you know, just dumb Berkeley journalism student, like, I'm just like this wide-eyed, you know, I'm very good at doing the like, I'm very naive, which is like, you know, because I'm very naive actually. But yeah, so sorry I'm rambling, but I spent the fucking year doing the documentary I did for my thesis, which kind of I've never been able to put it out for, you know, documentaries cost way too much money reasons. But basically, the year went by. I gained the trust of these little fuckers, and some of them admitted, yeah, some of our members are like actual neo-Nazis, and like look at pictures of Hitler's generals on their phone, think how cool they are, and like talk about wanting to nuke Israel in the group chat, and we've had to ban a few of them and stuff like that. And I basically got what I wanted to, which was to prove that they were little fucking Nazis, and that's why they invited Milo, because they wanted to hurt like brown and black and trans and like everybody else kind of people, you know? So yeah, that never panned out. UC Berkeley kind of fucked me over and censored my film, and like, you know, because Harmeet Dillon, the lawyer for, she's like a top like California Republican Party figure, and like she was the lawyer for the Berkeley College Republicans at the time. Like, she kind of like threatened the dean, and like they fucked me over, and my film never went anywhere, and my bridges were kind of like pre-burned going out of Berkeley. I wasn't going to have a professional fucking journalism career very easily through the connections that they sell you on when you go to the program. So I just started like working as a Lyft driver and continuing the beat, because it's like, well, what else I'm going to do? Like, just, and then that kind of just snowballed from there. I just like started a blog. I fucking went to these protests. Eventually I got made, and I had to be way more careful about it. And I just like kept reporting and just like, I look back at the early LCRW articles, and they're just like, oh, well, these people like had a fucking, like, these fucking violent Nazis had a Christmas toy drive, and I covered it in minute detail, probably because I'm on the spectrum. And like, I just did like fucking 2,000 words on them doing a Christmas toy drive where they yelled at like a couple of Berkeley high school kids. Why did I do this? And then years of that passed, and I was kind of like, when all of the COVID conspiracy theory shit happened, like I was like, oh, it's these people doing this. And I was luckily in a position where like I had made a little bit of money through selling some artwork and shit, and I was able to just devote 24/7 to LCRW and just like live alone in my apartment for a while, and like just report on these COVID fucking Nazis and like these COVID kooks and stuff, and like, yeah, it kind of just ballooned from there. What's the question again?
I don't remember. No, I mean, I wanted to hear just about how you got started with it, because it's been sort of foundational and broken a ton of big stories with it. And I think it's like we kind of had these weird, surreal experiences of things getting more dangerous over time. Now, Sasha, we used to go with a big group of reporters to a lot of these far-right events and walk right in. No one would give us a flack. I would go in, I'd have my press pass. You could see my name, you could see my face, no problem. That is not the case anymore. I don't know, how has it changed for you over time? Or, well, Sasha.
For me? I can't. I don't really like report on the far right on the ground anymore. I got assaulted by a Proud Boy on Main right there in 2018 or 2019 or something like that. Pulling him and like 5 other dudes off of this anarchist that they were stomping on the ground. That was a pretty intense moment, and I don't know if after that I've really gone that far out there. I mean, maybe I have, but just not to sort of observe and report. I don't know. But yeah, it's been pretty gnarly around here. Y'all?
I mean, it feels like a moving target. So directly after the election, when Stop the Steal rallies first started, I went up to cover for NBC in Vancouver, and immediately some militia members came up, pointed AR-15s at me, and said, "Don't even fucking try it." There wasn't like an argument. It wasn't like, "Hey, look at this guy." It was just like, "Hey, you come in here, and we're gonna attack."
That's right. Yeah, I went to Olympia. No, sorry. Salem. I went to Salem with Joe Lowndes, who's a really great writer on the far right and teaches over at the University of Oregon. And I was just stopping on my way back to Portland. They had a rally. There was like Black Lives Matter people on one side of the street and the far right on the other side of the street. And I went and I talked to some of these guys on the far right. One of them had a gun, and I was like, "Why do you have that? Like, why are you here?" And he's like, communism, and he's like, "We're just here to make sure that they don't do anything. Like, I'm happy to be here. They have the right to protest. We're just here to be the chaperones or something." And then I like turned my back for like 5 minutes. I'm not even kidding y'all, like 5 minutes. And it's just like, boom, right in the middle of the street. They're just going at it. This girl's getting beaten up by the right-wingers. And the dude who had just told me he wasn't there for violence at all, he's just like snarling, and he's like got this joy in his eyes. I just couldn't believe, like, this guy is just like invigorated and excited about the violence that's happening right now. And he just told me that he wasn't there for that, and he's armed. I don't know. People are like, this is my rationale, and this is what I'm doing, and then, they snap right into some other parallel universe, and I still don't know if that's because that's what they wanted all along, or if it's just because people snap. I don't know.
I think there's an element, a little bit of both. There's always this logic that they're actually here doing defensive things, that they're here because someone's attacking them,
Well, that's kind of, it's really ugly to say, but like, violence feels really good. Violence, like, hurting people, like, if you get used to it, it feels fucking amazing. So I think the core of it is like, yeah, a lot of these people really, really, really want a fix of that. They want to hurt people. And after like 5 years of seeing them hurt people, I kind of just think like, that's the core of it. They want a fucking boot on everybody's neck, and they want to hurt people, and everything else is just window dressing.
I was, so on my way over here, I was listening to It Did Happen Here, your podcast that you put together. And so folks who don't know, this is a multi-episode podcast in conjunction with KBOO, right? Help put it together.
It's a It Did Happen Here podcast.net, I believe. It's available online, and yes, KBOO did.
And the book version's coming out here, real quick, right?
Yeah, hopefully this spring the book will be, this spring or next fall it will be out.
So it's sort of looking at the history of the 90s here in Portland, Coalition for Human Dignity, Anti-Racist Action, other groups that had a very familiar history to what we kind of went through recently. I know when you're putting that together, you're thinking about this history. What are you thinking about anti-fascism now? What would you like to see? How are you feeling about what you see going on now? And what do you think about the future?
I think what's changed the most is the digital imposition of device dependency, social media, digital consumption, surveillance culture. So everything that happens now happens on camera. Not only do places of business and private residents have cameras everywhere that you can't see, but people are stopping, somebody could be getting stomped out when people, instead of intervening, they're gonna sit there and film. So that has a lot of implications. things that we used to get away with doing become viral. So the criminalization of self-defense and community defense is something that we have to be aware of. The far-right fascists have always been able to rely on the state, and the state, you know, the police, the military, and other armed, deadly aspects of the state have always been in solidarity with the far-right. So that gets utilized against those who are anti-fascists all the time. It gets utilized against people of color. Any marginalized, you know, non-white, non-straight people are always on the front line and always vulnerable. The other thing that happens is the left is on some pretty sickening bullshit when it comes to this urge to tear each other apart and get stuck in egotistical, self-righteous patterns of behavior, doing the enemy's work for them. So that is picked up by social media and weaponized against us quite effectively. And then, you know, honestly, you know, in the 80s, you know, so like there's these things that people say, like they'll show a picture of some soldiers in World War II and they'll be like, well, my grandfather fought in World War II and he was anti-fascist, but if we're honest, you know, the United States empire has always been fascist, right? So, you know, ever since the Southern colonial conquest, European powers and genocide of natives and enslavement of people, you know, there's always been a fascist empire. So, that said, fascism has always been mainstream, but in the 80s and 90s, you know, when we're anti-racist skinheads and the Baldies and ARA, it was more fringe. The violent element was more fringe. The violent element is more mainstream today. So it's not so much counterculture and people with certain uniforms that you can identify as much as it is just everyday, you know, people.
Well, we should go to questions here real quick. I just wanted to, I guess, get you two at the end. You know, we're coming up against the against the election. There's a big new far-right surge. Stuff looks a little bit different. How are you seeing it change in the next few months? What are you seeing?
Me, I tend to focus sometimes on like political ecology. We're out in Oregon and a lot of land use issues, and I'm seeing a lot of conflict between the federal, like Forest Service versus like the right-wing sheriffs in like various counties in rural Oregon. So, you know, there's gotta be a lot of change that's gonna happen with all these wildfires and all that kind of stuff, and so, you know, folks in rural areas are gonna, you know, be met with some restrictions on what they can do and can't do on private land and public land and stuff like that, and they don't like it very much. And so I'm seeing that kind of escalating right now in Oregon. I think that especially if the sort of balance of power doesn't really shift that much after November, I think that that's gonna get Bundy type, you know, situation happening here in the next couple of years. I don't know.
Abner, what are you saying?
I mean, there's one, I think there was, what county, I mean, there's a few counties that Malheur, or like kind of touches borders with, right?
Grant County?
Yeah, I think it was Harney and Grant. I think it was I just read this last night. There's a sheriff who arrested somebody who was doing like a controlled burn out there, right? Like somebody who was like a BLM employee, Bureau of Land Management, not Black Lives Matter for the folks at home.
You have to specify these days.
Well, yeah, you do have to specify these days. I mean, that's something interesting locally. I mean, I think the Bundy's network over the entire western half of the United States really needs to be paid attention to. I talked to a lot of folks out in like you know, Ashland, Medford area, like where the correct me if I'm wrong, it's the Yurok tribe, right? And there's I'm sorry, I forgot the name of the other tribe because I just what are they called again? The Hoopa, right? I don't know if I'm saying that right. I apologize if I'm not, but there's been like continuing like kind of settler colonial echoing conflicts over there over like their right to keep their right to keep maintaining the kinds of sucker fish that they eat, and that I feel like there's a lot of issues like that all up and down like this half of the United States that can be kind of turned on and off like a valve whenever there's like the right kind of like grievance. One other thing that's very, very disturbing that I'm going to be paying a lot of attention to in the next months is the great state of Arizona. I'm sure folks have seen a lot of the videos of men with guns watching ballot drop box locations. I think that's going to get really ugly. I'm actually going to go down there and help cover it during election week. So it's, I really think like kind of as a bellwether, Arizona really needs more prominence, like for just people who want to know what's going on in this field. And yeah, that's a big thing. I mean, obviously the other thing we should talk about at some point is like all of the libs of TikTok fueled like attacks on LGBTQ plus spaces, et cetera, but
and there was just one this weekend in Eugene.
Right. We're actually going to have an article up about it, and I don't want to. You can read it later. I won't diverge anybody's attention for it, but yeah.
Why don't we open up to some questions?